Good evening. We are so very excited to have Dr. Jesse Erickson of the Morgan Library join us tonight. He is nobly sacrificing his evening of attending a important event at his institution, for which we are extremely grateful and now slightly guilty. Jesse, never hesitate to ask me for any favor in the world, okay? Just putting that out there. His lecture tonight is Alpha's Adventures in Munchland, Black Bibliography for a New Literacy. Uh, I'm so excited. Some housekeeping notes. After the lecture, we'll have time for a brief bit of Q&A. If those of you at home have any questions you want to share, you can do so through the chat function, and I'll be keeping an eye out for your questions to share after the talk. We also have a Q&A function if you want to do that. I'll be keeping an eye on both. We will be recording this lecture, and it will be uploaded to the Illinois RBML channel on YouTube. Before we get started, we would like to note that as a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign has a responsibility to acknowledge the historical context in which it exists. We are currently on the lands of the Peoria, the Cascatia, the Piankashaw, the Wea, the Miami, the Mascoutin, the Odawa, the South, the Meskwaki, the Kickapoo, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, and the Chickasaw nations. It is necessary for us to acknowledge these Native nations and for us to work with them as we move forward as an institution with Native peoples at the core of our efforts. I would like to now welcome our speaker, Dr. Jesse Erickson, who is the Astor Curator of Printed Books and Bindings in the Morgan Library and Museum in New York. He has served as co-editor of the Papers of the Bibliographical Society of America, the preeminent journal for book history and bibliographical studies. He has also served as the vice president of programs for the American Print History Association, on the board of directors for the Center of Book Arts in New York City, and on the editorial boards of the University of Delaware Press and Birmingham City University Center for Printing, History and Cultures Journal, Publishing History. His research specializations are in ethnobibliography, alternative printing, and Black print culture. Jesse, we are so happy to have you tonight, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the invitation. Incredibly grateful. And this talk, I hope you are in for a marathon because it runs a little on the longer side. So you'll have to forgive me. I'm just going to jump on in. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming also. I really appreciate it. All right. So on February 2nd, 2024, Isis Nija Gaston, the Bronx-born rapper known in the music industry as Ice Spice, released a Roblox experience called Munchland. Now, games in the Roblox metaverse platform, I will note here, are called experiences. And there are over 40 million of them in existence today. The description for Munchland on the experiences landing page is purportedly from Ice Spice herself, or at least from someone on her team. It reads, and I'll quote at length, "Hi Munchkins, I heard some of you like my new song, Think You the Fart. So I made a game to play along. So grab your fart gun, rolling on the floor, laughing emoji, and let's blast some New York City rats. Dashing away emoji, blast New York City rats with your fart gun, cop baddie merch, and do the sturdy dance. Lightning emoji, graffiti artist, choose art to play, paint on the walls in Munchland, thumbs up emoji, like the game for more free UGC." And I'll end the quote there, and you'll notice I kind of skipped around a little bit. So the experience plays out exactly as described, allowing players to run through the virtual representation of the Bronx as seen through the perspective of Ice Spice's international brand. However, it's the language of the text that concerns us. For in the most basic of ways, it conceals transformation in language as expressed in text that have been occurring over centuries as much as it reveals them. In an article titled Ice Spice introduces Bronx-infused Munchland game on Roblox, posted May 31st, 2024, the women's streetwear news blog Snobette notes how the Florida-based PlayPal Studios game, quote, immerses players in a setting inspired by the rapper's Bronx neighborhood, end quote, offering access to exclusive merchandise. May and June saw a healthy amount of buzz around this Roblox experience, likely part of a larger marketing campaign to promote songs before the launch of Ice Spice's 2024 debut album Y2K exclamation point. Given Ice Spice's meteoric rise as a celebrity, many of your fans, adorably dubbed Munchkins, were shocked that the album release has been construed as a commercial failure. Not necessarily in terms of streams, record sales, maybe, but mostly among reaction YouTubers and influencers, although it was more positively received among the professional music critics. Since its initial release earlier this year, the Munchland experience has fallen into the simultaneously appreciated and maligned brain rot category, a term popularized by Generation Z, often used to caricature Generation Alpha's preferred choices of digital content as being completely devoid of substance. Epic Gamer TV's reaction claims that the launch was, quote, even worse than anticipated, while Sadical summed it up by stating that simply, it sucks. YT Barry White 149 went so far as to apologize to Ice Spice on behalf of himself and the fan community for declaring that, quote, this representation of our beloved Bronx is super exaggerated and offensive, end quote. Some streamers, like self-avowed Ice Spice fan Cheerios, had fun with it. But positive reviews of the experience, like the album, are few and far between. Yet with over 1.5 million visits to date, Ice Spice's brand identity has been able to market successfully to an audience of children in a way that few other artists have been able to achieve in the competitive vying for Alpha's infamously short attention spans. If this is your first sustained encounter with Ice Spice or with Roblox, reaction tubers, game streamers, or brain rot, you're likely functionally illiterate in this new incarnation of literacy. And you're not alone. Even though I previously believed myself to be relatively in touch with popular culture, attuned to a rapidly changing textuality, it was only in the past few years that I discovered the immensity of my own ignorance. Raising 2 Gen Alpha children awakened me to my illiteracy and led me to the realization that I had little competency, let alone fluency with this new vocabulary. It led me to consider that expanding my understanding of literacy even further would be essential for intellectually making sense of contemporary content. And when I commenced on this new educational path with intention, I quickly realized that one of the main threads in this complex philological web that makes up this new literacy is Black English vernacular. So in this talk, my aim is to begin making sense of it all. Why and sort of how we arrived at this place referred to simply as the culture. tracing the linguistic lineage of Black Vernacular English, known by the acronym BEV, and sometimes, the letters are reversed. So you say Black Vernacular English, it can be transposed. And its integration in mainstream popular culture through its historical literary antecedents and using a presentist framing, I attempt to illustrate both the potential and the cultural relevance of Black bibliography when applied to understanding this new literacy. The first part in a two-part series will focus on BEV's migration from print culture to an ascendant meme culture relationship, largely by singling out moments of evidentiary significance that signal and or embody the shift. Now, the second part, which will be delivered as the 2024 Schluter Lecture in Lafayette, will transition to a focus on an exploration of the gendered and racialized dimensions of Munchland's immersive narrativity, which is a form of narrativity that seamlessly amalgamates the affordances of the oral, the visual, and the digital in its textuality. But both draw upon Ice Spice's Munchland as sort of a case study for understanding this newly emerging form of literacy that is rapidly overtaking other more conventional models of literacy practice that have centered the codex as the primary instrument of textual transmission. Ice Spice as a brand, a media spectacle, she's an icon, all in one. She's not a bookish figure in the traditional sense. That would be laughable to suggest as much, but there are aspects of her brand, her lyrics, her Roblox experience, her reception in the media, which are all intrinsically textual, and more than that, textual in the most vital sense of the term. Now, in order to develop this assertion, which is at once radical, right, and rational, it's important to interrogate preconceived notions concerning the archetypal conceptualization of text as it relates to the book as materially incarnated in the age of print. For generations, the book has been seen as a liberating force with respect to its propensity for democratization, right? However, the rise of print has also been theorized as closely connected and sometimes more or less in a causal relationship with the concomitant advance of the epistemes of science and the colonization of non-European societies by Europeans. The latter, as it follows, is the cornerstone of this edifice, as it presupposes the radical part of the assertion by situating the historical development of Western bookishness as interfacing with and benefiting from elements of white supremacist ideologies that would reach maturation by the 19th century. Now, I am not suggesting in no way that every historical hallmark of the early modern book is a manifestation of white supremacy. Rather, in a much more nuanced fashion, it seems rational to seek to understand Print's web of connections that would benefit from, bolster, and become entangled with the forces that would emerge as these ideologies, and largely through the commerce, the conquest, the cultural appropriation, and exchange that comes with centuries of colonial exploits. The connections appear in many forms: in the resources and raw materials involved in print production, in the labor of print production, in the capital and wealth amassed from the exploitative or enslaved labor, which in turn contributed to the development of some of the most storied library collections of the period's most renowned collectors, bibliophiles, and scholars. And such connections likewise would set the stage for BEV's amalgamation with more standardized and literary forms of English in their formative years. Long before the transatlantic slave trade coalesced as the juggernaut of human suffering it would become at its peak, the first generation of European settler colonists devised methods of implementing the systems of enslaved labor toward their financial benefit. Ostensibly, the spread of Western religion would offer convenient, sometimes compelling justifications for the commercial enterprise. And because of that, a missionary infrastructure within the colonial expansion was quick to infuse itself within the establishment of the early plantations. Yet, it was the pursuit of capital and the pursuit of wealth that would eventually structure global commerce as we've come to understand it. And within that context, the book trade and the industries of print, which were without doubt at its core, Christopher Columbus was largely responsible for establishing the precedent here. And it is likely that he would have been, at least in some part, guided by models of commerce that were in development in the West African coastal regions and at the hands of the Portuguese, who broke into parts of West Africa by the early 15th century. Infamously, when Spain founded Santo Domingo in 1493, which became the first of a number of Caribbean settlements in Hispaniola, in place of the gold Columbus failed to produce as a product of his expansionism, he instead offered the enslaved indigenous Tainos as bounty and as proof of concept. Their labor, in a state of being for which Queen Isabella herself found odious, helped to build his own fortunes at a time when the stakes for a return on the investment could not be higher. It was his son, Ferdinand Columbus. He's known to us as an esteemed bibliophile and collector. While drawing in part upon the wealth and status he attained by being the son of Christopher Columbus, he built one of the most important library collections of the period, a collection which included over 1,000 incunables. It attracted humanists from all over Europe, including the Dutch philosopher Desiderius Erasmus, who, as many of us in the Zoom well know, for a time worked with Venetian printer Aldus Manutius. Spain, of course, was for centuries, by that time, a cultural contact zone for European and North African knowledge communities, where ideas competed with and influenced each other in sometimes contentious and other times consonant ways. The famed Professor Juan Latino, the first known Black European poet and writer in Latin of sub-Saharan African descent, for instance, rose to prominence in Granada from a state of enslavement under the second Duke Consort of Sessa. Having established himself as a Christian man of letters after a period when the Islamic cultural presence of Spanish Muslims was in decline and their offspring were being Christianized, his humanist networks would eventually encompass such nobles as Pedro Perdilla and the diplomat Diego Hurtado de Mendoza, whose library rivaled that of Jean Guerier's in scholarly depth, and who is likewise known for his binding commissions. The Fugger family is another aristocratic family known for their library collections, who achieved the status of nobility through commerce and the acquisition of capital. Like those of Mendoza and Guerrier, bindings commissioned by the Fuggers are still collected for their craftsmanship and their beauty. As Miriam Foote and later Robin Hollis have noted, the most sizable commission of close to 200 bindings came from Johann Jacob Fugger during the middle of the 16th century. And bindings were made for other members of the family over several generations. Fine Renaissance bindings such as these could only be commissioned by people of significant wealth and status. And the pursuit of wealth and status during this period of an expanding global commerce often involved overseas ventures. The Fugger family started in trade during the century prior under the line's founder, Ulrich Fugger. Ulrich's youngest brother, Jacob Fugger, elevated the status of the family by the end of the 15th century, particularly through his marriage to Sibylla Arts, Grand Burgess of Augsburg. That marriage allowed Jacob to assume the title of Grand Burgher of Augsburg, which then opened the doors to a seat on the city council of Augsburg. By 1514, he was an imperial count in the Holy Roman Empire, and by 1519, he spearheaded the group of businessmen that loaned 850,000 florins to Charles V to secure his election as Holy Roman Empire, of which Fugger funded more than half of the total. By the close of the 16th century, the Fuggers' business ventures, which included mining, had forged connections with the Welser family, for instance, in the pepper trade. The Welser enterprise was more directly tied to the transatlantic slave trade. But the Fuggers, although not directly involved in human trafficking, certainly benefited from it by integrating labor from enslaved peoples in their overseas operations. Now, these networks were just some of many, and they would bring more ethnic and cultural diversity to the Americas over time. And as these German merchant families used their leverage toward their negotiations in Charles V's settlement of Venezuela, enslaved Africans were forcibly transported to the islands and to the South American mainland to build up the necessary workforce and infrastructure needed to maintain these operations. By the beginning of the 17th century, when England's colonial exploits first gained a foothold in these quote-unquote New World ventures, the commercial incentives to establish settlements based on development of commodities was carried out by some of the same families who had introduced English printing in British settlements. Well, the Glover family, who would later be responsible for the printing press in the British colonies in America, had worked to increase their family's wealth, first by cultivating tobacco at Nevis, a small island in the Leeward Islands in the Lesser Antilles, located southeast of St. Kitts. However, when looking at how each of these threads, book collecting, binding commissions, the beginnings of colonial printing presses, etc., helped to set up the conditions for the emergence of BEV through power-based intercultural interactions, sourcing of raw materials that fed into and fueled the book trade, had the deepest impact. Mining for the metals needed for the type, sourcing and shipping of the wood needed for presses and press shops, enslaved and exploited labor in the press shops and in the shops of the leather workers. These are just some of the factors. The sourcing of cotton used in rag paper, however, is probably the clearest example of this dynamic. William Rittenhouse's paper mill in Philadelphia, first American paper mill, was in operation by 1650. And it was not long before paper became a competitive industry in that region. Fast forward to the 1860s. In 1861, Frederick Law Olmsted listed the world's dependency on the quote-unquote slave states of America for a supply of cotton as one of the tenets that was falsely used to justify the furtherance of slavery. Michelle Foa, in her 2020 study on Degas and the cotton trade, on the other hand, cited that more than, quote, 90% of the cotton imported into France just before the Civil War and over 60% of France's cotton imports at the end of the 1870s came from the United States. And even if the counter argument was that the resources and raw supply could ultimately meet global demand through diversification, the idea that cotton had a period of market dominance as a raw material for the production of commodities was an assertion on firm ground. As Klaas Rombach, 2010, has shown, even while cotton's peak markets had contracted, a network of smaller markets in Hamburg, in Antwerp, and even in the Baltic states persisted. Before the 19th century industrialization of papermaking, worn out and threadbare textile goods were used to make rag paper. Paper in Europe and the colonies had been made mostly of linen and hemp, but paper made from cotton was much less common. Yet, as the demand rose for cotton textiles in Western Europe during the 19th century, the raw materials for paper shifted alongside those changes. Mid-19th century demand for paper was so high as to cause a shortage, effectively incentivizing diversification in raw materials and paper-making processes. As described in an August 9th, 1865 issue of the Scientific American, I quote at length, in 1854, when printing paper increased in price 2.5 cents per pound, owing to the difficulty of obtaining a sufficient supply of cotton and linen rags for its manufacture, it so affected the publication of newspapers in our country and Europe that a number of them were forced for a period to curtail their dimensions. Appeals were made to chemists and inventors to institute experiments and endeavor to discover a cheaper substitute. In a very short period after this, scores of persons were reported as having discovered methods of making white paper from a great variety of materials, such as different grasses and plants, woods, etc. End quote. Undeniable is that during the interregnum between the early 19th century rag paper and the late 19th century machine wood paper, the enforced labor of peoples of African descent enslaved in the American chattel system contributed to the global production of printed material. The idea then that I'm getting at is that anti-Blackness as a way of thought manifested in the actions of individuals who sought to enrich themselves through business, and that such business, whether directly or indirectly, was used to advance print's utility as an instrument of communication, may be radically broad and sweeping in its assertion. Looking at the details, however, it's not difficult to trace connections that would lead one to arrive at this conclusion. The first page of a December 18, 1742 letter by stage actor Margaret Peg Wolfington to Thomas Robinson opens with, quote, my dear little Orinoco, an allusion perhaps to Thomas Southern's stage dramatization of Aphra Behn's now classic early novel, closing with, quote, my little black boy. It is a faint yet telling example of a transformation in the English vernacular, one infused with a simultaneous erasure, othering, and appropriation that was beginning to take shape, cutting across class lines. As the stage offered opportunities for upward mobility, the idea that a daughter of an Irish bricklayer would open with an allusion at once sophisticated and cruel to such personages is itself remarkable. As a woman who had been romantically involved with the famed David Garrick, she was but 1 degree separated from a living incarnation of Aphra Behn's narrative account of the slave trade in one Francis Barber. Barber, we know, became a core member of Samuel Johnson's household after having been enslaved. Garrick would inevitably have to deal with Barber in business, in the business of being in Johnson's circle. A letter from Johnson to Garrick written much later in 1765 notes as much. But I draw upon Wolfington's use of the name Orionco as an example, however slight, of the transnational appropriation of a comparatively nascent term in the English vernacular in its formative years, and its proximity to Blackness as a lived experience. One of Garrick's first roles as an actor came a year prior to the time the Wolfington Letter was written. See, in 1741, he played the character Abwin, a supporting role in Southern's Orinoco, a role, I should add, that he played in blackface. Wolfington and Garrick had moved into the home of Charles Macklin on Bow Street, Covent Garden, by 1742. Now, this was the same Charles Macklin, Wicked Charlie, as he was called, who had killed Thomas Hallam at Drury Lane, at the Drury Lane Theater in 1735, and apparently in an act of unintended manslaughter initially caused by a dispute over a prop, which led to disastrous consequences. Anyhow, Thomas Hallam's grandson was Lewis Hallam Jr. And Lewis Hallam Jr. was the actor and theater manager that was among the first to popularize the character Mungo from Isaac Bickerstaff's comic two-piece opera, The Padlock. Its premiere in Drury Lane in 1768 under the management of David Garrick marked a milestone in racial performativity, as it presented one of the earliest known appearances of the blackface minstrel in the comedic prototype. The Hallam Douglas Company's production, the Hallam Douglas Company headed the production's move to the British colonies in America in 1769, where Mungo was played by Hallam. However, prior to its successful reception in the American colonies, The Padlock was a favorite among British audiences, where the composer of the opera's score, Charles Dibdin, acted in the role of Mungo. Now, Charles Dibdin was the uncle of the famed bibliographer Thomas Frognall Dibdin, evidencing how interconnected popular music, literature, bibliography, and lexicography were in the foundations of the performativity of Blackness, especially when considering their proximity to Johnson and Garrick. Dibdin's score was dedicated to Garrick, and a presentation copy in its first impression was given to him, conveying with it an intimacy that was engendered by Garrick's support of the project. That role, which was among the first to cement the image of the black drunken fool in the minds of white audiences, would later be played by the distinguished American-born Black British actor Ira Aldridge. Aldridge, who began his career in New York City's African Grove Theater in the 1820s, would become a celebrated actor in Europe, where he achieved high honors. This second state of Miklos Barbaros's circa 1857 lithograph of Aldridge depicts the actor at the height of achievement. The Prussian Award on display and a caption that reads, quote, "Member of the Order of Art and Science conferred by His Majesty King William IV of Prussia, and holder of the Medal of Leopold and the White Cross," etc. You can see this is where the state of this lithograph is a little bit different, because you can see a very light impression of the medal there. The notion, however, that Aldridge needed to star in the role of Mungo to bolster his acting career was, in many ways, the encapsulation of the direction that racial politics were moving toward, particularly insofar as these politics were embedded in the social tension in celebrating Black excellence as a means of providing opportunities for cultural assimilation, and simultaneously stifling that excellence when individuals showed too much promise to succeed. Print artifacts of the period helped both to document and to spread awareness of the beginnings of performative Blackness. And there is an aesthetic continuity that ties the photomechanical stipple line engraving of Ira Aldridge as Mungo, issued by John Tallis and Company after William Payne, circa 1850, to two of the extant engravings of the same character as portrayed by Dibdin more than 80 years earlier. The conventional reliance on script-based and open Roman typefaces, combined with vine leaf ornamentation, matches the graphic design, not just of the earlier images of the Mungo character, but the first impressions of the printed score. In a like manner, the dandy-like attire of Mungo merges the fashion of the West Indian plantation aesthetic um, with the costumes of the carnival clown and the Italian commedia dell'arte, another precedent that would persist in its gradual transformation to the black dandyism of the mid-19th century minstrelsy. More telling, however, are the captions on two of the three engravings, which, in their appeal to market the more comedic aspects of the character, featured excerpted lines in Mungo's West Indian pidgin. The 1769 Butler Close engraving of Dibdin as Mungo, commissioned by Carrington Bowles, reads almost poignantly, quote, "Me wish to my heart me was dead, dead, dead." And the excerpt taken from scene 1 of the second act on the 1850 Taliesin Company engraving featuring Aldridge reads, quote, "Me get supper ready and now me go to the cellar. But I say, massa, ask the old man now, what good him watching do, him bolts and him bars and him padlocks," end quote. Now, both gesture toward the pessimism of a dawning global anti-Blackness, but the caption for the image of Aldrich as Mungo, which opted to highlight the master-slave relationship, speaks even more to the devolution of the period's race relations, as the institution of slavery itself began collapsing under its own weight. Its linguistic signification is further complicated by the presence of Blackness within the performativity of Blackness and its choice of dialogue, which includes an example of linguistic metathesis in the word axe, for instance, foreshadows a growing appetite for a new kind of dialect, which had emerged from an earlier period defined by the use of that catch-all phrase, pidgin. So from slave narratives to published folktale collections, the influx of Black American dialect and printed format would eclipse these earlier West Indian iterations and show the beginnings of a core philological mutation in syntax and in speech patterns, which cannot be reduced simply to an ignorance of the rules of linguistic standardization. And if the lineage of this moment of material copulation, this forced marriage predicated on the same violence that the book trade exploited toward its profit, can be traced to such literary figures as Afra Ben and Daniel Defoe, the offspring of linguistic innovation, having been infused with the beginnings of the English novel itself, would from that point become entangled with standardizing and legitimizing forms, transforming the textual culture for each generation thereafter. The proliferation of plantation dialect represents a long interstitial moment in the evolution of Black English vernacular and its adoption into the cultural mainstream. Its mushrooming 19th century print culture, tracked alongside the growing intensity of Black-white race relations, always intrinsically in conversation with those relations. The American Civil War was something of a launchpad for the kind of Black dialect literature associated with late minstrelsy of the Jim Crow era. Imitations and distortions born of white appropriation abounded in everything from lyrical broadsides to newspaper articles and poems to major novels. Published in 1899, then, Paul Laurence Dunbar's Poems of Calvin and Field was something of a dialect masterpiece, with both feet firmly standing in a mythical past. It succeeded in its aims, not simply in its adeptness with linguistic form, but also in its material makeup, from the binding to the Hampton Institute Camera Club stage photographs to Alice Morris's folksy ornamentation. Beginning with Dunbar's poem, The Deserted Plantation, receiving $100 for their photographs, the Hampton Institute Camera Club partnered with Dunbar's publisher Dodd Meeting Company for the project, which led to a series of other collaborations. Morris's design, though, which featured bold, rustic display type, combined with delicate minstrelsy ornamentation that interweaved watermelons and banjos within it, employed methods of the American arts and crafts movement further toward a marketing of a lost cause nostalgia. So Dunbar's use of dialect too worked a similar commercial angle. Yet in all its exaggerated folksiness, there was an air of authenticity in lines like, "Dem that used to be a prancing or a rolling in the sand on the floor," that escaped even the most seasoned beneficiaries of cultural appropriation, the likes of Mark Twain and Joel Chandler Harris. And as with virtually all of Dunbar's poetry, concealed messages of resistance to the established racial caste system were embedded in his double entendres. Dialect marginalized, minoritized, and appropriated certain aspects of Black American orality in order to weaponize it for political purposes, or more commonly, use it for the kind of entertainment that reinforced the stereotypes that propped up long-standing racial hierarchies. The New Negro movement of the Harlem Renaissance largely sought to push back against those stereotypes that were perpetuated in dialect in a conscious rejection of it, and along with it, Black folktales. What started with slavery in the West Indies, maturing in the cotton fields of the American plantation literature, finally broke from its agrarianism into urbanicity. In an urbanized version of Black English vernaculars, appropriation rose to prominence, one that would later flourish through a profound integration in new media. The shift paralleled the Great Migration. In post-Reconstruction, through the Civil Rights Movement, Black intellectual and political classes were aligned in seeking to front-load respectability and Black achievement in the interest of greater acceptance and enfranchisement. There was a concerted effort to counter negative racial stereotypes, in part by centering the most cultured elements of Black society. That agenda included an intra-racial marginalization of dialect by way of its deep ties to the plantation aesthetic. Yet the inability to completely abandon the folk tradition and its inflection on the vernacular led to varying levels of a sometimes cautious embrace by some of the leading figures of the Harlem Renaissance, poets and writers who were instrumental both in elevating the literary profile of Black cultural production and priming audiences, Black and white, for a shift towards street culture and the urbanization of dialect. Aaron Douglas, Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Richard Bruce Nugent, and Wallace Thurman led the charge with the single-issue 1926 magazine, Fire, which offered a piercing exploration of urban themes. A promotional letter issued by Thurman on behalf of the editors and contributors fully expected the reaction to its publication to be one of eyebrow-raising contention, describing it as a, quote, tour de force in the racial renaissance, and declaring its motto, quote, fire, Lord, in the new urban dialect. The cover art, with its vivid, abstracted Art Deco Egyptian motif printed strikingly in red and black, announced new directions for literature, now far removed from the country-like feel of Dunbar and his poems of Cabin and Field and other works. Thurman's Cordelia the Crude is a story that, in many respects, epitomizes the transition from an urban to a rural identity. Quote, physically, if not mentally, Cordelia was a potential prostitute, end quote. It opens as the story of a promiscuous teen navigating her way through Harlem street life unfolds as seen through the eyes of the male gaze. And when we hear Cordelia's voice at the end of the story, when she responds to being questioned about who her rent party dance partner was with, quote, "the guy who gave me my first $2, end quote, we catch a glimpse of the very literal transition of country dialect to street talk. From Ann Petry's The Street, 1946, to Langston Hughes and Roy DeCarava's The Sweet Flypaper of Life, 1955, mid-century Black literature sought to balance the deep psychological introspections of literary fiction with the authenticity of everyday urban life in the inner city. Yet the path toward critical acclaim that was first charted by writers of the New Negro movement, a path well traversed by the 1940s and 50s, was one that was necessarily constructed on the premise of white mediation through the publishers, through the critics, and even through the readers. Now, the most radical break from that mediation occurred with the revolutionary Black arts movement of the 1960s and 70s. It was the radicalism of this period of cultural production which set the conditions for the emergence and crystallization of the present day urban and street lit genres most conversant with BEV in its hip hop culture formation. In this sense, Gwendolyn Brooks is seen as a transformational and highly influential figure. Brooks, who earned many of the accolades of mainstream literary world, including most famously a Pulitzer, was a generational bridge for the younger generation of Black arts poets. Her poem, We Real Cool, was republished in 1966 by Dudley Randall's Broadside Press, marking her growing involvement with the politics of the period, which aimed to center Blackness in direct resistance to the white American mainstream's domination over publishing. The poem flows in a staccato-like motion punctuated by textual plunges off the sharp cliffs of pessimistic existentialism, at once a celebration of joy in the outright rejection and fatalistic acknowledgement of an American dream that eludes. All of that history, of course, is encapsulated in the word cool itself, which does a lot of work in taking its rootedness in jazz or individual expression within a democracy and further layering it with Black resistance, persistence. In other words, the ability to alchemically digest the rage of a dehumanized conditionality within the social construct, within the social contract, and transform it into a desirable appeal. Designed by Cleety Taylor, a founding member of the Detroit Arts Extended Gallery, the broadside in print renders the sonic visuality of the text like a game of billiards with sounds of balls striking on a pool table, and simultaneously presents the white graffiti-like lettering in contrast with the solid black background like a schoolroom chalkboard, and mirroring then the tensions that are playing out in the verse. Urban Lit makes its appearance a year later, in 1967, with the release of Robert Beck, better known as Iceberg Slim's Pimp, The Story of My Life. The same period that witnessed the revolutionary wordsmithing of artists like Gil Scott-Heron and the Last Poets Poetry Collective. In a collective blossoming of urban life, its language and its growing influence in the American mainstream, the same moment that gave rise to graffiti and hip hop culture. Slim's autobiographical narrative, intended for and successful among Black readers, offered a clear window into street culture that brought together aspects of the inner psychology of the literary world with the rawness and sensationalism that would come to define the Blaxploitation period of Black cultural production. The radical sensationalism was embodied materially in the graphic design, with a depiction of Slim's cool but menacing gaze behind an alluring woman who at once projects victimhood and agency. Much like in Brooks' We Real Cool, pessimistic fatalism tied to an implicit awareness of a pervasive anti-Blackness lurks in the descriptive blurb on the rear cover. Now here, Slim is described as a high IQ, quote, Negro in a white society, who has but two choices in his path of nonconformity, quote, criming or pimping. The pulp visual and typographical markers likewise suggest the aesthetics of nonconformity, but still integrate just enough of the conventional in letter form and design to, at the same time, disrupt it. Subsequent editions, all paperback, settle on the standard set of design features that include a feminizing slight swash in the pink bold sans of the title and a feminizing script for the author name, which are set either on a faux metallic gold or silver colored textured paper. And from there, we know how the story goes. The interplay of BEV's performativity, musicality, and poetics infuses the popular culture through print and in a myriad of other formats and media, including radio, film, television, and animation. And in this context, hip hop would fully saturate Black cultural production, reaching a high point during the first 2 decades of the 21st century, and changing along with it that American cultural lexicon. Sigma, gyat, and phantom tax are household words for elementary and middle school children. This new alpha slang, trivialized as brain rot, has permeated throughout contemporary meme culture, becoming social currency for the world's youngest content consumers. Born roughly between 2010 and 2024, 2024, Generation Alpha has been called the most online generation, usurping Generation Z with more than half of the generation already using social media. That's at least according to a recent report from the cultural strategy media research group Cassandra. Part of the reason for Ice Spice's lasting relevance in Alpha's meme culture in the face of an onslaught of criticism among older hip-hop reaction YouTubers lies in her seamless adoption of these new terms. Her August 2024 song, Gyat, is a case in point, springboarding off the popularity of songs like Sticking Out Your Gyat for the Rizzler, which went viral among alphas in the summer of 2023. Her comfort level with toilet humor, her alias of Miss Poopy, for instance, has only served to ingratiate her further with this demographic. Many of the new words and what has been dubbed alpha slang have clear ties with Black English vernacular, particularly as it's understood within the broader context of hip hop and the streets. Similar to the word thought, spelled out as an acronym THOT, GAT is, in essence, an acronym that has lost its internal semantic structural context. Phantom tax is literally drawn from the name of a famous Black influencer and YouTuber who represents the noun in the term's use as a verb. And with a following of over 9 million subscribers, a YouTuber with an even larger profile than Phantom is Kai Cenat. He has been instrumental in popularizing new words like Riz, Gyat, and Phantom tax. Kai Cenat's collaborative and live stream videos and shorts with Ice Spice have themselves become a subgenre of contemporary online content. The YouTube short of him showing Ice Spice how to do the popular sturdy dance received 40 million views. A few of the shorts, like the one simply titled um, Kai Cenat finds Ice Spice in Roblox, center online encounters, real or fabricated, in such metaverse gaming experiences like Fortnite and Roblox. Game streaming with commentary is among the most popular forms of entertainment among younger generations, especially Roblox, which has an entire industry of game streams, stories, and edits independently operating in a growing environment of digital entrepreneurism. Millions of young Black alphas are coming of age watching streams like Gaming with Kev, who built his brand from narrating his Roblox game stream. We've reached a place in the culture where there are nearly just as many people who play video games as there are people who read books. The 2024 Essential Facts About the US Video Game Industry report indicated that 61% of Americans between the ages 5 and 90 play video games, which equates to closer to 200 million people. Drilling down on those statistics, Roblox alone has an estimated 80 million daily users, with closer to 60% of those users being under the age of 16. So for context, that is globally over 50 million young Roblox players active on a daily basis, which is an impressive number considering that the total population of children in the United States is about 79 million. Compare that with the 65% of adults who reported that they've read a book in print in the past year, according to the Pew Research Center. And factoring in preferences for content consumption among children and teenagers, by some estimates, the number of video game players is just slightly higher than that of readers. Public intellectuals and critics lament that young students are losing their ability to read long-form novels. Rose Horwich's recent article titled "The Elite College Students Who Can't Read Books," for example, calls it out as a phenomenon worthy of serious consideration. So I brought up culture repeatedly, specifically in connection with the book. And I've referenced print culture repeatedly in exploring its relationship with visual culture and its conversation with street culture. And I'm using the culture here with a capital C in its triple meaning. The contemporary state of Black culture, the contemporary state of popular culture, and then their influence upon each other. Now, that relationship encompasses the degree to which Black English has had an impact on contemporary American English, and its migration from print cultural mediation to digital and social media spaces becomes central to this larger construct. A 2018 study, in fact, looking at a single platform within that sphere, X, formerly known as Twitter, found that Black English vernacular is the main source of lexical innovation. So how, then, do we begin to situate this transformational trend as it unfolds as layers upon game streams and their chat sections and servers from Twitch to Discord? Contrary to viewing these developments as constituting a decline in literacy, I challenge us to think of them as part of a larger transformation in textuality. This new textual landscape is overlaid upon the digital visuality of new media entertainment and digitally mediated storytelling. Within each Roblox experience, for example, there's the underlying code, there's the gameplay's storyboard, the gameplay's textual narrative, the interactive narrative. And within every Roblox game stream is the narrativity of the stream, the textuality of the commentary, the orality of the interactivity. And the rapidity of the shifts in literacy practices that are entangled with these forms of textuality is creating conditions for real-time disruption of conventional grammar and syntax through a heavy reliance on phonetic spelling, abbreviation and acronyms, emoji, GIFs, and especially memeing, which combines all such factors, including a hyper-specific variation in digital typefaces to stylize avatar fashion and usernames. Many of these elements, I would argue, saw prototypical approximations in print, such as the rebus's visual likeness to the contemporary use of GIFs and emojis. And seen in this light, Munchland, in all its digital textuality, from its chat to its street signage to its virtual graffiti and its gamification of the Bronx, the birthplace of hip hop, is emblematic of this new literacy's relationship with Black English vernacular. In both architecture and design, it is layered upon a history that has long preceded it in print. I have long been interested in thinking about how Black bibliography can be activated through a presentist framing of historical text. It has led me to speculation on the value of this way of thinking. And you may have noticed the conspicuous absences of major titles in this discussion, like Harry Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, Thomas Dartmouth Wright's Jim Crow performances, or Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. However, in sketching out intersecting moments that trace connections between print culture and the appropriation of Black orality as layers that undergird the textuality of new media, there were other works in a vast universe of titles and moments that I've selected to center in this analysis. The value of Black bibliography, I contend, is not limited to the analysis of Black authored works as material textual objects. It is a framing by which Black culture can be understood through these analyses and by extension in connection with other global literatures inclusive of non-Black text. It is a method by which one can arrive at a better understanding of contemporary race relations in the world, both as it is and as we have come to know it. Thank you.
That was awesome. To heck with part one and part two of this talk, Jesse. When are you doing a book? No
um,
pressure, but
I don't know. I've thought about I've thought of I mean I have to I'm still working on another book project that I really want to get across the finish line in the next couple of years. But I definitely have been more interested in exploring contemporary meme culture and connecting the world of print to what's going on right now. And it's all moving so fast that I feel like anything that is published will like immediately be obsolete, you know.
yeah, that's really true. So for folks in the audience, we'll now do a bit of Q&A. If you want to put a question in chat or in the Q&A function, I'll wrangle both. To get us started, I have a very selfish question because I enjoyed your talk immensely. And I'm thinking about digital cultures, and I'm an elder millennial. My early experiences of digital culture is from the 90s. And as a teenager in the 90s, one of the first things I did was to go online to read Star Trek fanfic. And one of the things that recurred was in Star Trek Voyager fanfiction. For those out there who are not Trekkies, Voyager had a character named Tuvok, played by the actor Tim Rice. Tuvok was a Black Vulcan, and this was the first time you saw a member of the Vulcan race, most famously portrayed by Leonard Nimoy as Mr. Spock in the original series. And there was a trope or there was a kind of genre of fan fiction story, which would be a standard fanfic story, whatever you want, transformative work in which original stories happen, as written by someone on the internet, usually teenagers like me. Also some people who are older. But where Tuvok would be written to be speaking in BVE. And there was an element of that which was racist white fans, but there was also an element of Black fans pushing against, because Tuvok was one of the smartest characters of the series. He was one of the most highly educated characters of the series. And here's the thing, because this was in all of the 90s, so much of this has been completely like obliterated from the record because it was digital. And so, Jesse, what I'm wondering if you could comment on in terms of like documenting our culture writ large, when so much is digital and ephemeral, and of course there's this whole thing of like print itself can be ephemeral. Um, how can we document some of these things that we are seeing? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. I've thought about that a lot. Okay, so first of all, I want to note that Star Trek itself has been really, really important in the conversation around racial politics in the country and was a key player in bringing that conversation forward to mass audiences in really sort of smart and sophisticated ways through the characterization and sort of the way that, it was almost like a futurism that that pushed those conversations to the surface through certain iconic characters and scenes and things like that. So I just want to recognize that, put that out there. So it's interesting. I'm not a Trekkie, but I'm aware of that history, and it's interesting that that plays out in the fan fiction space in a really curious way. And so I'm fascinated by the idea of that, right? And how different fans kind of use this character as a medium to express, sort of their own identities or their own relationship to the franchise, and sort of how like that plays out. I feel like that's that's a whole avenue of exploration that one can go down. Um, but in terms of your question of how moments like that become documented, um, so in this new textual paradigm that I am trying desperately to understand and figure out, uh, the methods of preservation and documentation that we have become accustomed to in the age of print, right, don't necessarily translate. And I think a lot of trouble that archivists and people in the cultural heritage sector face when encountering, um, digital textual artifacts uh, stems from the desire to kind of graft on the older principles and the not just the methodologies, but the principles themselves, right? Um, to the new media, right? You're gonna run into a bunch of trouble. And there's been in so many different conferences and so many different panels about all of the challenges of trying to apply those preservation models, right? Or even documentation models, right? For the folks, I'm talking to the MLA people that are really interested in making sure that this kind of stuff is citable and and can be referenced in scholarship, and in other discourses, right, that are invested in understanding it intellectually. So that's the challenge. But as scholars and librarians and archivists continue to struggle with how to sort of get our heads around it and deal with it in an organized and systematic fashion, the people, right, that are sort of like the lay people that are involved in the fandom or involved in the content creation sphere themselves have developed their own ways, right, of doing that. And so for that in particular, I would say there are two paths that have emerged that have become clear to me that uh, are already doing this kind of work. One is huge, and it stems from the largest reference source that is in existence now, and that's Wikipedia, which took over all encyclopedias and most reference sources. But the, sort of stemming from Wikipedia are wikis, right, and fan wikis. And so for these fast moving developments in content creation, storytelling, and textual culture, uh, these fan wikis seem to be like endlessly expansive. And I don't know. I mean, because they're collaborative, right, and they're participatory, and everybody kind of well, I mean, Wikipedia is a very close sort of closed circle, but these fan wikis, there's a lot of passionate people that are involved in, and no matter which sort of corner of niche franchise that you find yourself exploring, lo and behold, there's a fan wiki, and there's so many different pages that you can go keep. drilling down in these pages, and it just seems crazy because some of these things are like months old, and all of the characters and all of the scenes, they all have their own wiki pages, and they're all very detailed. It's like, who's creating these things? um and that gets in. And for things like machinima, for instance, which is a genre of visual content, that's popular on video streaming services like YouTube. And it's very composite in nature, right? You have these different digital assets that are being combined in a compository way, and combinatory, almost ad infinitum. Um, Even these machinima, you can trace down those digital assets in like Steam fan communities, right down, and there's a copious amounts of metadata attached to these small little digital assets. I'm talking about the particular sword in a Final Fantasy game or something like that, that's then reused as a mod. Like, it's all being done by the people that are passionately into that work. So that seems to me the route of preservation. I think that archivists and librarians are not paying attention to what's going on there, so they don't know that there's already a lot of preservation work going into it. The second path that I pointed to would be the actual, like, sort of meming itself, because through the meming, it's things are kind of like remixed again and again and again, and as they are remixed, uh, the additional layers are added upon them. And then for those, you have to look in the comments. And for the comment section, people that are really attuned to that sort of segment of the meme culture will point out, hey, this is a remix of a classic meme that came out, 10 years ago, that's been, and so then people, it'll point, sometimes there's a link. I'm thinking of the duck in the lemonade stand, right? That meme is like over 10 years old. Uh, the last one, the one to like end it all, just was released. Um, but for folks who are just coming into that, right? And if for every meme, there's thousands of, if not tens of thousands of different variations, right? That are content, all user generated. Uh, Eventually in those comment sections, you're going to get pointed to the source material, right? And that the same goes for what feeds into the memes from, sort of earlier textual paradigms, like print culture. Like, if there's sometimes, there'll be Greek letters in a book, um, that's featured in a meme, and somebody will point out, oh, I think that's that. What is that lettering? Oh, I think that's Greek. Um, so these things all play out in the comment sections, and people kind of like hash it out in real time, and then often point to more formal mechanisms of documentation. So that's part of that textual environment, that landscape that we live in. And I know it seems like sort of dizzying because there's no organized, systematic way of going about it. You kind of have to like find your way through, but that because of the ephemeral nature of the material, and because of how fast it moves, that seems to be the only way uh, that it's captured. So, in your case with the fan fiction, a lot of that source material may be gone, but in that case, it might be Reddit or some other forums that somebody will find that will point to that. I mean, it's out there. Somebody remembers that went on, that happened, and at that point, it becomes a conversational thing.
Yeah, I have friends that go way back, and I keep thinking one day I need to do some kind of oral history. So thank you for such an in-depth and thoughtful response. I'm not seeing any other questions, so I'm gonna selfishly ask you one more myself, which was, I really like how you went from Paul Lawrence Dunbar straight to Gwendolyn Brooks. She and her Dunbar was like a big deal in her household, and her mother wanted her to become the Lady Dunbar. Um, and I've always found it really interesting that there's that kind of familial context for her. The fact that Dunbar goes back and forth between BVE and conventional English in his poetry, where she sticks much more to conventional English and often very elevated English. I'm thinking of like, 75th anniversary of Annie Allen, its reprint. I mean, I was just like hit over the head all over again, like the elaborate nature of her verse. And so my thought there that this kind of nascent is I've been thinking about our poetry today and how it's in a curious sort of position because on the one hand it's a big deal. We have a country laureate. We have the US poet laureate as a position at the Library of Congress. We have state poet laureates, um and yet poetry is not widely read and is frequently published as perfect bound chapbooks. And yet nonetheless what I see as a reader is that a vast quantity of contemporary poets writing today are Black Americans, people of color, people of other marginalized identities. And so I'm kind of thinking, I guess my thought here is again like coming back to these ways of dissemination and um on the one hand we have like this big cultural recognition, on the other hand we have like such a kind of bottleneck of production, a kind of it's just weird to me, and I'm wondering, can you comment on that?
Yeah, I have thought a lot about that. I've thought a lot about that, and with Paul Laurence Dunbar in particular, I've thought a lot because I see him as a sort of um, a really sort of important person in the gradual shift to poetry's place in the world today, right? It's sort of status and its positionality, right? And I think about it in direct relation to like sort of non-rhyming free verse and rhyming poetry, right? Because rhyming poetry was so popular up through, let's say, the Paul Laurence Dunbar's time, right? And it's really becomes a 20th century phenomenon where rhyming poetry starts to recede more and more. Um, but what comes to the surface uh, is our lyrics, right? And lyrics, particularly coming out of Black cultural space. So I'm trying to understand, the relationship between hip hop and poetry, right? And whether one can consider hip hop as poetry. I do, but not all others share um, that sort of thinking. And there are arguments to be made one way or the other. And perhaps it's that not all hip hop is poetry, but some hip hop is poetry, or some hip hop is poetic, or some poetry is in conversation with hip hop. Then you have spoken word is sort of this kind of third space, right? That influences both, right? Um, so yeah, it seems to me that Paul Laurence Dunbar is very popular, right, as a poet, in part because of the style of poetry that he is trafficking in, right? And much of that is pandering to a white audience because he is, trained in sort of classical verse and and in some respects laments that he is sort of pigeonholed in this in this space where he is most popular for the style like poetry, right? But it shows that there's an appetite, right, for that style of poetics, right? And that I think only increases in popularity through musical channels, right? Um, and I think it even has an impact, right? Jazz impact on beat poetry, right? And it's the development of spoken word and what goes on in the 60s, as I mentioned, with um, like Last Poets and Black Arts Movement, right? Which has the cadence of hip hop, but the looseness of free verse, right? Which is what contemporary spoken word is pretty much known for these days. Okay, so even within poetry, spoken word in the open mic is the most popular, way to get at it. Now, literary poetry is a different thing, and that's what's been in decline more than anything else, in my view. Right? People just, I mean, it just doesn't have a market like it used to. It doesn't sell like it used to. But in its place, you have hip hop, which is it's huge. It's still extremely big. It's not as big as it was a couple of years ago, but it's still, it's almost ubiquitous. And the most accessible form of poetry that your average person is going to encounter outside of like the hip hop space is that spoken word, right? So I think that split, is directly tied to Black cultural production and Black poetics, right, and how it's manifested through hip hop. And I haven't really been able to articulate a clear thesis on, what my theory is on how that emerged, but I'm in a very sort of informal way. I'm seeing Paul Laurence Dunbar's moment as part of a gradual larger shift to this place that we find ourselves in the culture today.
So what immediately strikes me is I think we tend to forget that poetry was originally sung, and the fact that like taking the music out of poetry, like that's, you don't have this notion. I feel like the notion of poetry is elevated art comes concurrently with like silent reading, and when you're taking the music away,
Mm-hmm.
and so that's sort of what I'm thinking about. But and
Yeah, no, I agree.
yeah,
If you
yeah.
hear Paul Laurence Dunbar's poetry, um, read properly, right? Proper elocution of the dialect. It's beautiful. It is so gorgeous, but it's very hard to pull off. I mean, you have to be skilled, even for people who grew up in the culture, grew up communicating in that way, to get at the dialect poetry and the typography of it. It takes a minute to figure out the inflections and the nuances of it, but once you do and it's done properly, I mean, it's gorgeous, and you're transported back to a you're transported back to a time and a place where it feels very natural for that style of communication to be expressed in that way, and it is like the quintessence of poetry. It's gorgeousness to the ears.
Well, one of my favorite poets of all time is Kevin Young. And
Mm-hmm.
for those of you at home, he is simultaneously the director of the African American Museum at the Smithsonian. He's also the poetry editor of The New Yorker. He's written a number of fantastic books. My favorite's the one about Basquiat. But one of the things he's done in I believe he has 2 volumes of selected poetry, and the ways he presents this is his remixes, and this notion of like like this is music and poetry concurrently, like on the page, and it's like, I mean, when you do a remix, it's usually like when you're combining different tracks of different songs, right?
Right, right.
And so when he's doing it as selected poems, it's taking these pieces from his other books and rearranging them in a different way. And I love that notion like so much. Um, it is just awesome. Anyway, we could probably talk about. Oh, someone has asked a question in Q&A.
Right.
Um, oh, not a question, but an observation. This conversation reminds me of the series The Breakbeat Poets, the work of Chance the Rapper, Jamila Woods, etc., and in general, the connection of the written spoken word to hip hop culture, especially in Chicago around the early 2000s. So, yeah, I think absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Um, so, unless there are other questions, I understand you have a party to go to. I hope it's still going.
It is still going. Yes, it is still going. Yeah.
So in that case, I want to thank you so much for hanging out with us tonight. This has been a real pleasure. Um, yeah, this was awesome. Thanks to everyone who came tonight. We will be hosting this recording on our YouTube channel, and we will be posting it when it is fully transcribed and online. And this has just been truly, truly phenomenal. And Jesse, I want to thank you so, so much.
Oh, I appreciate you. I really do. And appreciate the opportunity to help me, sort of think through these things. And it's been a pleasure. So, and thank you all for coming. Thank you all for staying. It's late in the evening here on the East Coast. But wherever you're at in the time zones, I appreciate your attendance. And yeah, I hope you were able to get something out of it.
All right. Looking forward to part two, sir.
All
Everyone,
right.
have a great night. And yeah, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.